Good morning on this chilly Tuesday morning. One could almost forget that it's spring. But something that we can never seem to forget is that South Africa is facing a very deep crisis. And I want to welcome you all. I'm Terence Corrigan, Project and Publications Manager at the Institute of Race Relations, and I'm joined today by my colleague, IRR Researcher Anlu Keeve. We are here to launch a report, a new report in our Blueprint for Growth series, reinforcing South Africa's growth through infrastructure. Infrastructure, the hard sinews that on which an economy rolls, the power that keeps a modern economy afloat, the roads and the rails and the water systems. That not only make an economy work, but that make society possible. And it's not contentious at all to say that we've experienced some challenges. Anlu has been busy at work for the last couple of months, looking into this issue, and is here to give us an overview of her report. Before we begin, I would like to welcome everyone again, to thank our viewers, listeners, readers, and our supporters, those who generously give to make our work possible, and in particular, words to the Atlas Network, whose generous financial support made this report possible. And with that, let me turn over to Anlu, and let's get this conversation underway. We will go through a slideshow, then we will open the floor for any questions, comments, and we are hoping for an energetic engagement. Anlu, over to you.
Hey, Terence. Hello, everyone. Okay, so what do we have on the agenda today? So firstly, we'll consider whether building a massive funnel over South Africa and capturing all the rainwater in the country and piping it directly to Gauteng is the answer to all our water woes. And then we'll have a look at whether we should give every citizen a stationary bike so that they can generate their own electricity at home. And lastly, we'll have a look at whether catapulting all our goods to our trading partners across the ocean is the best way to solve our port congestions. Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, as fun as these ideas might sound, the reality is that the challenges we have in our infrastructure actually need real solutions, and ones that don't involve medieval siege tactics. So we have an actual agenda today. And on this agenda, we'll have a look at, well, first I can perhaps mention that the fact that you made it to the presentation today actually already means that you understand the importance of infrastructure for the economy. So we'll have a brief look at the productivity effect that infrastructure has on the economy. And then we'll have a look at the economic context in which we find ourselves. I think we're all familiar with the conditions we've been living in. So we'll just briefly touch on the context, and then we'll move on to the key infrastructure sectors. Amongst these, we'll discuss water, electricity, rail and road, and ports. And then finally, we'll have a look at what we can actually do about many of these infrastructure challenges in the country. Wonderful. So why is infrastructure such an important topic, and why is it the topic of an entire report? Well, so infrastructure, whether it's ports, whether it's rail, whether it's water, whether it's electricity, it has a simple productivity effect, which basically means that when we improve our infrastructure, whether it's building new roads or having more reliable electricity, it helps all our other resources, whether it's labor or capital, to actually do their jobs better. So people and businesses can now achieve much more with the same resources. If you take a look at the flow chart we have on this slide, you'll see it shows how investing in infrastructure, in this specific instance it's roads, can actually boost labor productivity. So when we improve our road infrastructure, you'll see that we have much better and much more reliable transportation infrastructure. And this comes in the form of whether it's a smoother road, a wider road, whether the roads are actually better connected with each other. It all leads to transportation being much more reliable, and specifically public transportation among these. If you then follow that swirly loop arrow thing, you'll see that commuters obviously now experience much shorter travel times to work, and they're traveling on more improved conditions, which means that they could commute to work much faster. And it has a positive influence on their actual focus at work. You can see that they are not as tired when they arrive, they didn't have as much delays, and delays, and never mind unplanned delays. So it basically boosts the overall labor productivity. And I realize that these might seem like very small wins when we look at them on a microeconomic scale, but this is exactly why we think it's such an important topic. It's because it benefits every other aspect of the economy. In the example we've shown here now, you can see that the small adjustments that you make have such a big influence on workers and businesses on an individual and a local level. And it's just one part of the productivity effect. If you have a look on the next slide, you'll see in this flow diagram, it shows how investing in infrastructure, have a look at, I don't know if you can see my arrow, I'm assuming you can. If you have a look over there, you can, I see there's arrows missing, but the flow will go like this. I do apologize for that. So it shows basically how investing in infrastructure creates a ripple effect throughout the whole productivity chain, production chain. So say, for instance, we invest more in infrastructure. And it's perhaps important for me to mention here that when I say invest more in infrastructure, I don't necessarily mean only you have to spend more money, although that's obviously a major part of it. It also means that ensuring that your investments are actually allocated efficiently. It has a similar positive effect. But okay, so say we invest more in infrastructure, we then see our labor productivity go up, just like we saw in the last diagram. And then this means that our business can now get much more done. And then this is where we start to see the multiplier effects throughout the economy. So the initial investment can now actually lead to much more economic activity than the original amount we actually spent on it. And we can start seeing businesses to actually attract more economic activities, they attract better talent, and then obviously it reinforces investment again. If you have a look, so that's the positive reinforcing cycle that investment in infrastructure has on the economy. And I think the country is in serious need for these positive productivity effects. I'm going to move on to briefly discuss the economic context, as I mentioned earlier. But I think it's necessary to mention that although I'm discussing the economic context and the little bit of theory we just discussed separately, I think they're really two sides of the same coin. If you consider that the economic context itself is actually such a powerful reminder of why infrastructure is so important for our growth and development. So what I've done here is these three indicators that I sorry, I do apologize, just a second. I hope that's better. I see the reflection in my glasses. I hope that's a little bit better. I do apologize. So, okay, anyway, back on track. The three indicators that I included here on this slide, I didn't just pick them because I think it's areas that South Africa is actually doing very bad in. Although that would have been a good narrative and story, but it's not the case here. I think they actually genuinely reflect the health of the economy. So if you take, for example, the unemployment rate, it gives us a very good idea of the health of our labor market. Right now, it's at 33.5% on the official definition. And I think people like to over-explain sometimes what this means. But at its core, it says that we're not using our labor resources. And this leads to low consumer spending. So If we want our economy to grow, we need to focus on our unemployment rate. We need to create jobs. And ironically, infrastructure projects happen to be really good at it. The next indicator I have here is the per capita income figures. This gives us a good sense of the average standard of living in the country. And I think it gives us an idea of how wealth is distributed and also how the economy supports individuals in creating their own wealth. Unfortunately, we really haven't seen any growth in this area. If you consider in 2008, per capita income stood at $12,628,000. By 2019, it had gone up slightly. We see it at $13,740,000. And by 2023, it actually dropped back down to $13,280,000. So when we adjust in this sense for purchasing power parity, as these figures have been adjusted, we can then see that it's not only that individuals' income, the income of individuals are struggling to actually keep up with inflation. We see it reflects a much bigger issue with our economy, actually. It shows that it's not growing. And in that sense, it's not moving forward. So even if other areas seem like they might be improving, the average South African isn't seeing real improvements in their standard of living. I've also included the debt to GDP ratio here, which I think shows how well an economy can actually handle its debt compared to other output, compared to overall output. And right now, our debt to GDP ratio is at 74.6% of GDP. This is the highest it's been since 1947, and it's putting pressure on the private sector. It's making it much harder for businesses to actually invest in infrastructure for the future. And that's exactly what we need to focus on. It's long-term investment. If we keep going on at the rate we are currently, which is where 20 cents of every rand we collect is going towards servicing our debt, it limits the whole country's ability to actually fund the very infrastructure that can boost our GDP and that can grow our economy. So these indicators, I included them because they have a direct impact on our infrastructure. And we know that without well-maintained roads, without railways that operate efficiently, without stable electricity and clean quality drinking water, it's very tough to achieve and never mind sustain economic growth. And this is why infrastructure must be a top priority in any reform plan. If you have a look on the next slide, you can see I've included a key measure of our infrastructure, the gross fixed capital formation. And it shows us basically how we are investing in our future, in the future of the country. If you consider that the 2012 National Development Plan, the NDP, has a target of 30% for a gross fixed capital formation target of 30% of GDP for 2030. And you consider that we've only hit a 20% once in 1994. Since 1994, we've only hit 20% once, which was in 2008, as you can see here on the graph there. Then, it becomes a real concern. If we want any economic growth, we need to increase our investment in infrastructure. So what we're going to do now is we'll have a look at the reality on the ground at various infrastructure sectors. We're going to start with water. We'll move through to electricity, and then I'll discuss separately rail and road, and then ports. The only reason that I'm actually discussing them separately is because they differ quite a bit in terms of reality on the ground, but I'm grouping them in terms of solutions because they share quite a few similarities in that sense. Wonderful. So let's start with water. I'd like to open the section with a quote. The late Luna Leopold, he was a prominent American hydrologist, and he said it best, I believe, the health of our water is the principal measure of how we live on our land. And I think when we consider that this when we consider this graph, which is from the National Blue Drop Report from the Department of Water and Sanitation. It shows just how true it is. If you have a look at the graph, so over the past 10 years, the quality of water has gone down. Where my arrow is, that's 2014, in case it's a little bit small, and that's 2023. You can see that it's nearly 30% of wastewater systems that are now in critical state here, as indicated by the dark and the bright red. And this is actually up from 174 wastewater systems in 2014 to now 277 being in critical state. And then if you consider that in 2023, we had only 26 of these systems meeting Blue Drop certification. And this is compared to 44 that qualified in 2014. So it shows us very clearly that there is a decrease in the quality of water that we are receiving. We'll move on to something that I think is very important in terms of showing us firstly, how old our infrastructure is, how old our water infrastructure is, and whether it's actually keeping up with demand. So what we see in the data is that although more households now have access to piped water inside their homes, there's major regional differences and disparities. And it becomes especially clear when you actually have a look at the water interruptions that the country faces. So on this graph, you can see that the national average is at 35.8%. And when you compare that to in the Western Cape, a 3.4% and Gauteng 22.8%, Gauteng actually interestingly went up from 15% last year to 22.8% this year. So I think anyone in Gauteng is not surprised by that. Western Cape went down by, I think, 1.5%. But then if you look at Mpumalanga, it's at 66.9% of households that reported that they had water interruptions lasting for at least 2 days. And this gives us a very good idea of the fact that is a very good reflection of the idea that the water infrastructure is old, especially so in rural areas, and they are not keeping up with the demand in many of these areas. Excuse me. Wonderful. Not wonderful, but okay. So there's there's many reasons, but I think the few that we've listed here are very important in the sense that these gives us the most important ideas of reasons why water services are actually getting much worse. So if you consider that many water systems are running way beyond their capacity and they haven't actually been upgraded or fixed when they needed to be fixed. If you have a look at the infrastructure leakage index, which is that little IRR you see there, it worsened from 4 points in 2013, which indicated that the physical losses was managed actually quite well, to being 7 points in 2023, which indicates that its physical losses are very poorly managed. And we see water losses in exceeding 50% in several of the provinces. Then another very important factor that contribute to the decrease in quality and reliability of water services is the fact that contractors and service providers aren't actually being paid on time. This is a very serious concern in terms that equipment breaks, pumping breaks, treatment systems fail, and it overall just disrupts services. If you have a look at the third point there, you'll see that it's quite an important thing to consider that vandalism and theft. It sounds odd because we're talking about water and I mentioned electricity cables, but obviously the pumps need to run. And if if electricity cables are stolen and say other equipment is damaged, it makes whatever infrastructure we have at the moment much weaker. Then there's an issue of many boreholes that's non-operational, and there's no proper system to track much of the water flow in the country. You also see, and this is a very important point, I'm also going to mention it a little bit later again, and you'll hear me say it several times throughout the presentation, but the skill levels of managers and the technicians and even the engineers, there's such a large variance. And it brings us to a point where we just don't have the right people to actually manage much of the water quality. Then a very important point here, and it was actually a shocking statistic to me, is the fact that 45% of municipalities can't provide basic information like what was the monthly water usage. And I think to fix the problem, we need to improve the communication and the data capturing mechanisms to actually understand where things are going. Excuse me. So the important thing here is that if we want to fix the problems of water losses and of service delivery, the most important thing is that we need to first understand what the problem is. And for this, we need to have accurate and regular data. We need to know what the problem is so that we can fix it. We're then moving on to electricity. So South Africa has faced nearly 2 decades of load shedding. And although I think it's today 190 consecutive days without load shedding since the 26th of March this year, it doesn't take away from the fact that we really struggled to manage this crisis. If you have a look at the graph, it indicates the decline in the energy availability factor. And you can see, so just as a point of reference, in 1999, the energy availability factor was at 91%. And by 2007-08, during the very early stages of the load shedding crisis, it was still actually okay. It was at 84.8%. And then by 2013, we start seeing it dropping below 80%. And in 2019, it fell below 70%. And then obviously last year, it hit 56%. I think it was even lower at some point, but on average 56%. And so if you consider this declining trend, you see that the energy availability factor actually decreased by
I think we may have lost Anlu. I'm sure she'll be back momentarily. But I think what we're getting from this is that we've seen a steady decline. In other words, we just aren't producing the electricity that that we need, and that's where the trend line goes. From so what caused this? Well, failure to invest in generation capacity. That's something that's been on the line for some time. Certainly, I remember in the 1990s, Eskom warned that they would not be able to underwrite the continuation of economic growth unless significant new investments were made, and that was effectively ignored. I remember that was one of the very few things, the only thing Thabo Mbeki ever apologized for. Then there's the failure to conduct maintenance. Basically, these things were breaking down, but all the incentives pointed towards simply keeping things rolling over. Or not so much perhaps a case of things breaking down. I seem to have lost the slide. Sure. Okay. But we had a case of a refusal to conduct planned maintenance to keep things rolling, and that meant that when the breakdowns finally happened, they became quite lethal. I wonder if it would be possible to get that PowerPoint up again. Unless I've been sort of stranded here. I apologize, everyone. These sort of technical glitches do happen. There we go. Okay, great. Please, Anlu, I'd sort of filled in, but Not with your level of knowledge. So please carry on. We've just been
No,
talking
please.
about the
Thank you,
failure to
Terence.
conduct maintenance.
Thank you so much. I do apologize for dropping out there. So I'm going to try just pick up where I left off, which is why we are actually in the situation we are in. So, in brief, I think the decline in our energy availability factor and the electricity supply system more broadly, it can be ascribed to a combination of effects, and much of it is decisions that were made. So the initial crisis, I think, was mostly because there wasn't enough investment in new power plants and in doing regular maintenance. So by the time that we actually got to the point where newer power stations had been commissioned, the shortages was just part of our daily life. And over time, the failure to actually conduct maintenance and then Eskom trying to push it out a little bit longer to try and avoid load shedding just made things so much worse in the long run. And at the end, it just led to so much bigger breakdowns. Then, very importantly, obviously, is the fact that Eskom was actually used to promote other goals, and it became somewhat of a platform for the government. Well, it still is to some extent for the government's empowerment agenda, excuse me, through much of its procurement policies, and it was a central site for corruption. I think that's not a surprise to any of us. And then obviously there's the long-standing reluctance, which I think is mostly ideologically driven, is the fact that they were against private sector actually producing and providing the electricity. So I think those are the main reasons that brought us to this situation we are in at the moment. I think it's important to mention that we delved into a little bit deeper in the report, so I would advise everyone to go have a look at the full report. But I think the gist of it is that the electricity sector and infrastructure problems has cost South Africa so much. And I'm not only saying it in terms of missed opportunities, but I'm also saying it in terms of real economic growth. In 2023, early 2023, the South African Reserve Bank actually estimated that at the time power was being cut between 6 and 12 hours a day. And they estimated that it cost the economy between 204 million. So let's say between 200 million and 900 million a day. That's a huge loss. And especially if you think about the impact it has on individual sectors, mining, agriculture, even small businesses. So it's lost of a lot. It is a lot of missed opportunities for one country to bear. I'm going to move on so that we can have a look at the rail and road infrastructure. So again, we sometimes tend to complicate things, but I think we can take the importance of good, reliable road and rail infrastructure at face value. I hope that's the right way to say it. But it's as simple as if we don't have it, trade slows. And if we don't trade, everything else comes to a standstill. So I think a powerful testament to the importance of rail and road infrastructure is the fact that it's estimated that like 50 billion rand in potential revenue was lost from ore exports in 2022 due to the rail issues at Transnet. So it has a significant impact on the economy. If you have a look at this graph, you can see around 2017, Transnet moved 226 million tons of goods by train. And then by 2022, this number dropped actually to 154 million tons. And that's a 30% decline over 5 years, which is, it's insane. In 2023, the CIA actually reported this. The ratio of goods moved by road compared to rail was 8-1. And it just shows us basically how we shifted to using trucks instead of rail because of the failure of rail. And I think although we can actually see in the graph that road has picked up some of the slack that rail couldn't, it comes with its own set of problems, obviously. I mean, it's damaged roads because of heavier vehicles on it. It's higher fuel costs. It's much more maintenance that's required, much more road accidents. There's a big jump in CO2 emissions. There's actually, I think it's a train uses a third of the energy needed to move the same amount of cargo as a truck over the same distance. That's a third of the energy. So by using trucks, we see a big jump in the CO2 emissions. And then very importantly, we see the safety of truck drivers. And for this, I have a very interesting graph. Have a look at that. You can see that this is only for the number of truck hijackings, but I think much of the broader safety risks also become evident when we actually observe the steadily increasing trend. I mean, truck drivers have repeatedly been exposed to blockades on the N3 corridor between Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. And all of these risks and additional risks and costs obviously contribute to much higher logistical costs, and it affects the investment decisions of farmers and the investment decisions of miners and manufacturers and other businesses. And then obviously on top of that, it affects the inflation rate. And in that sense, it obviously then affects us, average South Africans. I'm going to move on to have a quick look at the current state of port infrastructure in the country. And I think it's important to mention that South Africa is in large parts attractive to foreign investors because we have an abundance in natural resources. But if we can't actually export these commodities, foreign investors can take their money elsewhere. And it's exactly this that limits the growth potential of our industries. It limits the growth of our industries. And we've established that the economy depends on trade to actually grow. However, for us to trade, we rely on ports to actually be efficient and effective and to be able to manage much of the complex trade environments and requirements that comes with imports and exports. So the infographic that you see on this slide, it's the rankings for the Container Port Performance Index. And you'll see in 2021, when 370 facilities was ranked, Gqeberha ranked 312, Durban 364th, and Cape Town 365th. And then for 2023, of the 405 facilities that was ranked, Gqeberha ranked 391st, Durban 398th, and Cape Town 405th. The fact that South African ports are performing so poorly 2 years later shows that there really hasn't been much real progress in terms of port efficiency, firstly. And then I just want to mention that I know that the South African Association of Freight Forwarders, I'm missing an A there, but I'm mentioning it. I know that they argued that much of the rankings were actually way too harsh, and that the Cape Town port and the Durban port, for example, handled much bigger vessels and much larger quantity of vessels than ports that ranked much better than them. And I do think it's a valid argument, but I think it's a valid argument in the sense that it would be unfair to compare much smaller ports and the capacity that they have to much bigger ports and the capacity they have. The direct comparison might be a little bit unfair. But what I think is important and what we should take away from the ranking here is that regardless of whether it was overly harsh according to them, I think it highlights that the country is actually falling short in its capacity. And if we want to actually have better trade environment and have an see economic growth, we need to improve also how other countries view our ports and how efficient the ports can actually run. So for that, I'm going to show you this. Have a look here. If you see, this is why the ports ranked poorly. yeah, so first consider obviously the global average. The time vessels spent in ports on global average is 40.5 hours. But in the port of Durban at Pier 2, it takes twice as long. It's twice as long. It's 83.2 hours. There is in May last year, May 2023, the Western Cape government published a series of reports, but the final report was published in May of 2023 on the transporter congestion at the port of Cape Town and in the congestion in the logistics chain. And what the report found is that one of the biggest issues in the supply chain was the poor condition of its equipment and especially its rubber-tired gantry cranes, which I'll call RTGs from now on. But out of the 23 RTGs, there was only 4 that were fully functional. And if this is the case at the port of Cape Town, I'm sure it's the case at many other South African ports. I suppose many people might sit and think, okay, well, my Takealot package takes a little bit longer to get here, or my Amazon package takes a little bit longer. Let's just be patient. But actually, it's much worse than that. If you consider that you receive you're an importer and exporter, and you receive an unexpected announcement, that there will now be a congestion surcharge of 3,850 rand per container at all South African ports because of congestion. In this sense, congestion, additional costs, and already long delays at the ports, it affects South Africa's competitive advantage, and it affects both our supply chains and our value chains, which is a big worry for South Africa. So wonderful. Now that I have been negative for the past 45 minutes, I think, 38 minutes to be precise, it's time to have a look at what we can actually do about this. And I encourage everyone to have a look at the full report, specifically if you're interested in the estimated costs or to get the water infrastructure back on track, so to say. But for the purpose of the presentation and time constraint, I'll simply mention it's substantial. The government can't fund it alone. They can't fund and manage the restoration and expand. It's simply not possible. There's budget constraints. They have, as we mentioned earlier, very limited technical expertise in the civil service. And then there's obviously competing priorities, as we've seen with many of the GNU discussions up until now. The fact that, within the parties in the GNU, there's obviously different priorities in terms of who's actually responsible for much of the service provision. But so there's competing priorities in terms of what to place at the top of our priority list. So to actually turn around the negative trends that we've seen, whether it's water, whether it's the quality of water, electricity, and our ports inefficiency, it's the most important thing is that local municipalities and the national government, they need to proactively work with the private sector. And in cases where the government, say, need to improve their service delivery without actually handing over complete control of their assets, the report suggests a lease agreement, public-private partnership lease agreement model. Excuse my tongue. Anyway, so it allows the public sector to, in the sense, still be the owner of much of the infrastructure, and then just outsource the day-to-day activities and operations to the private sector. And in the sense, then basically the private sector can be contracted. They'll then manage the daily operations. They can do the maintenance, and you can even have them be in charge of protecting the water supply system, say. So have a look at the report. There's a little bit more of a detailed breakdown on what many of these agreements might look like. But in the essence, the idea is that public and private sector, they need to negotiate a contract, decide on the scope of work, the duration of the agreement, and also the this is important, the performance metrics that they'll actually use at the end of the day to determine the compensation structure of these agreements. And this is important because the idea is that private entities should be compensated based on how they perform and, say, their service reliability, how reliable their service is, the quality of the water that they provide in this instance, how satisfied the customers are with their service delivery. And this will then create a very strong incentive for the private partner to maintain the high standards and to deliver on quality services. Yeah. So, what can we actually do about this? Firstly, the first step, improve municipal asset management. This is, I think, the origin of much of our maintenance issues. The fact that we can't actually manage much of the assets that's currently in ownership of the municipalities and national networks. And this would then, under this, I would include deciding on which public, I'll just call it PPPs because it's a real tongue twister. Deciding on which of these PPP models fits the needs of municipalities and the national water infrastructure in broad. The next thing that is very important is we have to actually deal with the inconsistency in both the technical and the management capacity at a civil service level. So under this, I'd advise perhaps standardized training across all sectors of all levels of management. In this sense, we can really help to make sure that personnel are actually, they meet the minimum competency standards. And an additional step would be to actually mandate continuous personal development. So say we involve academic institutions or private sector experts, because this is where the knowledge, industry knowledge actually lies. We involve them in actually helping to ensure that the personnel in government or in these local municipalities know what the latest industry standards are and they know what the best practices are. And I think this can, over the long run, really help to foster a culture of excellence and accountability. And then very important, I think, is give local municipalities, local water management teams, a much greater level of autonomy, both in terms of the decisions they make and in terms of hiring. If we group this with having targeted training programs, I'm sure that the personnel trained and having the autonomy to make decisions based on local problems, they'll be able to come up with much better solutions and be able to much better prioritize according to local needs. And I'm going to mention this quite a few times, but I think at a government level, at a national level, many of the government officials are sometimes out of touch with reality. And in this sense, giving autonomy back to these local water management teams can help us to actually prioritize the correct things in accordance to what needs attention first. And then there's a very important point that I'm also mentioning quite a few times, is the fact that we have to streamline communication between the government departments and the municipalities. We need to have better mechanisms to actually capture the data. We can't have 45% of municipalities not being able to report on monthly water usage. We have to prioritize water losses. We have to prioritize actually management of non-revenue water. And then very importantly, we have to prioritize investment in rural areas, investment in water infrastructure in rural areas. And we discussed this briefly in the first section of the presentation, and I probably shouldn't babble on again about it, but the idea is that by investing in rural areas and ensuring that they have much better water infrastructure, say, it also invites businesses to the area, and it invites more people to actually move, more economic activity in the area, thereby inviting more talent. And then, we obviously see these areas develop. That's the long and short of it. Then we'll have a look. The next is the electricity solutions. Okay, so the first thing we need to do if we want to make sure that South Africans have reliable and affordable electricity is that we have to remove bureaucratic regulation. They slow down the generation process, they drive up cost. Part of this is allowing private producers to actually sell electricity back to the grid. And I'd advise anyone, if you would like more information on this, have a look at the report. But we have to separate Eskom into three parts: generation, transmission, and distribution. And the idea is to privatize generation and then to keep the transmission section state-owned. And finally, then the distribution aspect of Eskom can be handled by whether it's a mix of municipal and private entities. It will depend on the area. Okay, then again, as I mentioned in the previous solutions, we need to allow power producers, whether it's private or public, the freedom so that they can hire staff and handle their procurement independently, without any race targets, without any political interference. Producing affordable and reliable power should be their primary priority. Another priority that they should have, and this is a very important aspect, is that they should prioritize payment collection. So the idea here is to increase the rollout of prepaid electricity meters so that customers can, in the sense, then pay their electricity in advance and manage their consumption much better. And as part of the effort to actually prioritize the collection of payment, we'll have to double down on illegal connections and bypassed meters, because at the end of the day, it's these meters, these non-paying consumers, that drive up the cost for fee-paying consumers. And then lastly, I think we'll have to make sure that we get some form of exemption from strict green mandates. The cost involved in transitioning prematurely from coal to renewables, it's simply not within reach for South Africa at the moment. Then let's have a look at the last section of solutions. We have our road and rail and port solutions. As I mentioned, I'm discussing them together. So the idea here is, I think the first step should be to establish a specialized railway police. This is something that the Institute of Race Relations has been promoting for a while. And the idea is to protect new and existing infrastructure from theft and vandalism. To actually do this, we might have to align some regulations so that we can actually establish a force in compliance with the Police Act. Another very important point here should be to actually communicate with the interested parties. So as I mentioned earlier, government officials are often out of touch with much of the reality on the ground, and it makes it so much more important for them to actually set up consultation networks in which they can then discuss what aspects of the infrastructure network should be first priority and should receive our attention first. And then important here as well is exploring which PPP opportunities best suit the local needs and priorities of the local and national networks. We discussed earlier the shortage of RTGs, for example, and the long wait times at ports. And I think this is two examples of market opportunities where the private sector can actually help and accelerate procurement. It's important, however, to mention here that the report, and that's why it's important to actually have a look at the report, it mentions that you have to consider, when it comes to deciding on a public-private partnership, on which model to adopt, you have to consider the fact that it's generally more effective to rely on public entities to provide what we call public goods. And public goods and services, non-rivalrous, meaning if one person uses the good, it doesn't reduce how much of the good other people can use. And public goods are also non-excludable in the sense that it's very difficult to actually keep other people from using the good if they don't pay for it. So these goods are generally made available by the government to all members of society, and they're typically funded through taxes. But so the problem here is that, and the reason why it's an important consideration is the fact that there's some built-in limitations in actually letting the private sector supply public goods, and it's the fact that there's obviously a strong incentive for public use, for people who might use a certain service to actually understate their demand. And then because it affects the supply and the prices at the end of the day. And then even though they understated it, they still want to benefit from others paying for the service. If you have a road, they might say, no, I'm not going to use the road, but then they actually benefit from the road. So it becomes very difficult to actually determine an actual equilibrium market price in this sense. And we tend to see a situation where if the private sector provides many of these services, we tend to either have an over or an undersupply of public goods. But yeah, so Transnet's obviously plagued by corruption and inefficiency. So we have to consider the fact that it makes it unlikely that private sector parties would like to actually work with Transnet because they most likely won't be able to resolve many of the shortages in the short term and many of the challenges in the short term. So it's likely to disincentivize the private sector to actually participate because it undermines their incentive for profit and any attempts that they have on a return on investment. So, okay. The reason I mentioned all of this is because a model like a build-on transfer public-private partnership would be ideal in this situation. So you have the private company, it builds the needed infrastructure, they are responsible for securing the necessary financing, and they also take on the financial risk, obviously, associated with construction. And you then just include them in the planning and the procurement and so forth. But once the infrastructure is actually completed, it's handed back over to the state at a predetermined price. So the report details it a little bit more, and you're welcome to go have a look. But the important point is that we should actually explore these opportunities and see what fits the local needs. Then for this to all actually work, we need to have a transparent process in granting a concession-based ownership. And this is the case for all aspects of infrastructure if there's a public-private partnership involved. And then just a few last practical reforms is actually to improve the communication networks once again. It is to set up regular meetings with truck associations, say, and then or industry representatives if it, and then additional measure would be to actually standardize much of the container management across all South African ports. I think this can go a long way. And then this is more a point of interest. It was interesting to me because I thought that this is a simple thing that you can actually correct. But it seems like it's a little bit more difficult than it seems. So at the Cape Town port, for example, and this was mentioned in that final report I mentioned earlier, is the fact that they don't actually have handwritten handover documents when the shifts change during port operating hours. And this causes some confusion between the people who hand over from one shift to another shift on what the schedule is. And they also don't have those lists that have the delivery appointments and collection schedules readily available. So it makes, you need to definitely, if you want to have more efficient ports in South Africa, you need to standardize much of the management that goes through the ports. So that is the solutions from my end. I think it's impossible. I honestly think it's impossible to overstate how important infrastructure is for our economy. If South Africa aspires to higher growth, which we do, for economic growth, and if we want more jobs, which we do, and if we want better quality of life for all our people, which we do, once again, I think getting the basics right is the most important thing. So what is it that we want? What is the basics that South Africans want? We want to turn on the tap and have clean water. Want to flick the switch and know that the lights will come on. We want to drive on well-maintained roads. We want to, if we're a business, we want to transport our goods on rail or road and know that we have both options. And we want to have quick and seamless import and export processes. And I think the purpose of the report was, in the end, to reflect on these basic needs and to bring it back to the point that this is infrastructure. And none of these things are actually particularly remarkable. And it's only that when they fail that we actually notice them and that they come to the center of our attention. And they have failed. And they are now at the center of our attention. So I think it's time that we actually, not actually, but it's time that we start doing something about it. It's the only way that we can grow the economy. Yeah. Terence, that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Anlu. And I think your conclusion was apposite. When these things are simply seen as part of the environment, where you simply do turn on your tap and water comes out, you rather forget about the system that exists behind, and particularly the choices that are made. I'd just like to make one small intervention. The question of non-payment. This is complicated, I think, by two things. One of which is the idea that that utilities are, and I think with some justification, regarded as a kind of human rights question. That's been court cases over this, which does limit the ability of a government to institute that sort of credit control. And that is tied very closely to another question, to another issue, that a lot of the non-payment, the non-payment crisis is bound up with what is politically possible. People often forget that that South Africa's non-payment goes back to the rent and service boycotts in the 70s and 80s, particularly in the 1980s. And the expectation that this was part of the democratic transition. I remember in the 1990s there were attempts to launch what was called the Masakani campaign, which was translated into "Let's Build Together," which part of which was about getting people to pay. And there was an assumption that with a legitimate government, people would do so, but there were simply hard incentives built in now. And you had situations where cities like Soweto just racked up enormous bills that were politically uncollectible, and they were typically written off. But I do think that we often miss another fact here, that some of the non-payment is actually on the back of institutions, businesses, government departments, where government institutions are lackadaisical, corrupt, or dysfunctional. And it makes sense. There's a perverse incentive to use that as a source of cheap credit. And I do remember at one stage, although I think the calculus has changed dramatically, that in the 1990s, if the entirety of a place like Soweto didn't pay, the effect would be fairly limited, simply because the big users were elsewhere. And many of those big users just decided that, if they could get away with it, they wouldn't. So, these are all they're big political questions here. Now, I see that when we talk about political questions, I see that that there are a couple of comments that have been sent, and one of them says, "Do you feel hopeful that the current, I'm going to say, incumbents in office will welcome any performance standard or outside advisors?" I think this gets to the point about private sector involvement. And this, I think, is fundamentally a political question or a policy question. Over to you.
I muted myself. I'm back. Yeah, Terence, I should say I am hopeful, but I'm hopeful in the sense that, and I hope this isn't naive of me, but I'm hopeful in the sense that the data. So, okay, let me do this. If we can show the GNU and many of these high decision makers that there is actually examples of the public and the private sector working together, it should be testament enough for them to actually implement it in many other aspects of the infrastructure network. So if I can, for example, mention one, well, it's technically two, but it's one big thing. So South African Waterworks, it is a private company. I think it started in 1999, and the idea is, so it operates in KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga, I think, and it basically services the Ballito municipality and the city of Mbombela. And so under South African Waterworks, you actually have the Caesar Water. It's divided into two entities, Caesar Waterworks, and please excuse my pronunciation on the second, but it's something like Silulu Manzi. And I think it's both of these are excellent examples of the public sector and the private sector working together. One of the standout achievements is actually the fact that Caesar Water, they were in 1999, they signed an agreement for a 30-year lease agreement, and they were involved in, I think, the construction, the maintenance, some of the billing and the debt collection, and much of the day-to-day operational activities as well. And the fact that they constructed and they operate a direct reuse plant that I think they produce 3 million liters of potable water daily. Caesar Water is the third best rated water service provider in South Africa last year. And
Right.
Silulu, pardon me?
No, just agreeing with you there.
Silulu Manzi supplies 120 million liters of safe drinking water to 400,000 consumers on a daily basis. And it's the only service provider in Mpumalanga that received Blue Drop certification. I think I don't want to involve feelings here. So it's easier for me to say, if we can show, and here we are showing, there's examples where this is working. Give it a try in other aspects. And I think that is enough for at least a consideration. Yeah, I don't know whether that answers the question, but I think it gives some insight into that it can actually work.
There's another comment which I think refers to the ability to state-proof ourselves where these services do not function. To be able to live without without undue harassment or incapacitation by an often incapable state. And it's been suggested, I'm not sure if the evidence bears this out, that part of the respite we've had from load shedding has to do with the extensive public rollout of particularly of rooftop solar, which has at least cut down some of the consumer demand, or at least got certain parts of the market off the grid. I would imagine, though, this is probably not something that will be possible across the board. I mean, think about ports. You have a port where there's a bay, and you need a great deal of money to be sunk into it. Your thoughts on that?
I think important thing to consider here is the fact that it's not necessarily so achievable on an individual level. It's I think much more achievable on a big business level, in the sense that it costs them more not to do it than it costs them to actually do it. But on an individual level, if you consider households, it costs them so much more to actually put up solar than to just sit in the dark sometimes. And I think I unfortunately don't know this statistic, but I know that there has been a recent uptick in the amount of solar companies that's actually declaring bankrupt in South Africa, simply because of the recent, like lower levels of load shedding we had recently. So you have to consider that much of the demand for electricity, and in that sense, private generation, whether it's reusable energy like solar and so forth, it depends on whether we actually have load shedding. And although people
Right.
might actually, obviously, if they have it, they're still making use of it. But if they don't have it, the chances of them now putting it up after we've had 190 days of no load shedding is much lower.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, look, on that, I actually spoke to a business that deals in solar, and they say that they can project the trajectory of their business 100% on the in terms of when when load shedding happens, and they say that one of the problems with that is that to have the panels available to be installed immediately, you have to keep stock, and there's a lead time to get it. And if something changes in the meantime, you can be stuck with millions and millions of rand you can't move. There's a question here. Mine is just a comment and not a question. Red tape remains one of the key challenges in fostering effective private sector investment and public infrastructure development. That's not just a national issue, but a provincial one as well. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Not much to add, but I can perhaps say that I think so. I received an email, and perhaps I can now mention it this morning about. I won't disclose names or anything, but somebody emailed me this morning in regards to the presentation and mentioned that she has been struggling to actually reach out to NERSA in regards to local issue about unregulated electricity volatility. Excuse the format of my words here, but she's basically been struggling to actually reach out to them and for them to actually come and have a look at the problem. So I think in that sense, and that's why it's so important to also streamline much of the communication systems. If you have to actually reach out to a government and it's an emergency, you need to actually be able to get a hold of them. Whether it's a spokesperson, whether it's and they are quick to say, yeah, but we are reachable. You just don't know where to reach us. But it's not the case. It's definitely not the case. And I think the first step, at least, in getting some of the red tape off and away, is starting to actually be able to get in touch with them, report a problem when there is a problem. So
right. Yeah. Well, I can attest to that. We were disconnected to my household for a couple of days because they decided that we owed them 70,000 rand, although there was actually nothing going at all. It was their glitch. But on one day, they managed to send 3 inspectors to come and read the meter to confirm that they from 3 different service providers. One of whom laughed at me and said, the problem with you people in the suburbs is that you pay. They wouldn't dare do this in my part of town. And then they simply showed up and said, well, we're going to cut you off and you must go back and you must go to the office and argue the point. On water, last week we had 4 outages. Same pipe, just kept on bursting. Okay, there's a comment here. I understand that all the obvious issues with electricity have been discussed, but how many people are aware of underlying unnoticeable issues cause great losses? Unbalanced network conditions in Europe are costing billions of euros annually. I've addressed this on a blog article of my website, and I suppose I could say this is by Bertie Bezuidenhout. I suspect that has to do with lack of backup and things like that. Too much demand at any one point, not enough at another. Any thoughts there?
And not enough regulation. If there's not somebody, it was a while ago, and I know this is water, but I'm pretty sure it has a similar effect here. The fact that they didn't actually turn the taps. And I think to a large extent, you can see similar problems here in the sense that there's nobody to actually regulate it. There's nobody to actually check whether the correct voltage is going through. I'm not going to pretend like I know exactly how it works, but I'm pretty sure there is somebody who is supposed to know exactly how it works and who isn't doing their job. whether they're not being paid or whether there's a problem with the system at large. I think much of it owes to the fact that there's not somebody actually regulating it.
Okay, then we've got another comment here. It says, no maintenance by quasi-government. Sorry, just no maintenance by quasi-government units defaults to breakdown maintenance, which is more expensive. And I think that's what we said earlier about if you don't do these things in time, you have to rehabilitate, which ends up costing a lot more. Incidentally, this was a problem being flagged in the 1990s. Improving infrastructure and handing it back over to the government resorts back to the broken down condition. The deterrent to working with such centralized groupings for purposes of sanity. There is a high need for change at the source. And I think that gets to the question of political control and policy. And the man in RSA Street is looking forward to the age of freedom, from a high level to low level, where the best person gets the job. And I think that gets into the question of beware of using your infrastructure to drive some subsidiary purpose. I think we were actually in the same forum a month or so ago discussing the public service, and there were various objectives that the state was trying to achieve simultaneously, and it was simply one of the easiest and politically most attractive things for the government to do in the 90s and early 2000s was to fiddle with demographic proportions, because you could put that on a spreadsheet. Things like how well people do their work are difficult. You need managers who can assess that, and to be able to assess long-term workflows. But when it all got caught up with a single and what was effectively a tangential political prerogative, the whole system started to collapse. And someone says, in Cape Town, you phone, they come fast and keep in touch until it's fixed. So it's possible. And then somebody responded to that by saying, no, it is not. So I think we have varied experiences. Okay. All right. Please.
Can I just add something to not the last comment, the one before that? I think I understand the problem of actually having to then, so we have a agreement with the private sector, they actually construct the infrastructure, but now we hand it back to the government. And this is why it's so important to actually address, I 100% agree, we need to actually address who's at the core of the management. And in some instances, it would help to then actually put the private sector at the center of day-to-day operations, which would help to actually manage much of the concern in terms of having to hand it back to somebody who's just going to neglect it again. So yes, it is definitely important. It doesn't only help we have this partnership, and it doesn't see it through to the long run, because then it's obviously going to be exactly the same situation. And then, sorry, another point just quickly is the fact that you're 100% right. If you look through an annual report from any government institution, the first 15 pages of that report is on race equity. They discuss how much of the company is now, what the demographics in the company has changed like over the past year. Which, I mean, instead of actually reporting on how efficiently people in the company has done their job and did their work and how many KPIs have been met, they're actually reporting on who the people are who are supposed to do their job. Yeah.
I see that Bertie Bezuidenhout has corrected my my deficient technical knowledge. Thank you very much. Unbalanced network conditions are caused by broken conductors and switches not closing properly. Are you aware that not addressing backlog maintenance can run up to a ratio of 15 times the cost of normal maintenance? I can say that I wasn't aware of the ratio of 15 times, but I was aware of substantially more. If 15 times what it is, I have no reason to doubt that. But I think the point holds. That
thank you for sharing that. That's very insightful.
Allowing a problem to metastasize, is the difference between needing a minor surgery and dying. And with that, I think we are we've run somewhat over time. So I'm going to thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank Atlas again. And I would encourage everyone to go to irr.org.za, click on the reports tab, and you can find Anlu's contribution. And please do keep in touch with us. Daily Friend show at 1:30 every day. The dailyfriend.org.za, or is that co.za? I often do forget these things. And yes, please do keep in touch with us. dailyfriend.co.za. Do keep in touch with us, and thank you very much for your support. And with that, wonderful day further.
Thank you.